for 15 years.
Sorry, buddy. Oh. That's a cut.
Welcome, Steve.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
Yep,
Yeah.
round 3 for the podcast, and we're going to have to keep doing rounds because you keep putting out albums. And so album number 1, this epic photo of you with the Golden Gate Bridge, and folks can listen to our previous chat about just the story behind this and the story about Home Base, your second album, which came out during I guess it came out after the pandemic or at the tail end, hopefully, of the pandemic. And then this next album, Urban Bass, you've got all sorts of ensemble music on this one. And I was just walking the dog and listening to you play with Jerry Seamus and Carlos Ortega, correct? And
Russ
Jeremy
DeLuna.
Cohen. Yeah, wonderful album. So congratulations.
Thanks.
And tell what was the inspiration behind this one?
Well, thanks to you and others in the San Francisco Bay Area bass community, I was invited to play at one of the many bass bashes that we have at an annual event. And I am friends with Jeremy Cohen, this sort of very, classically trained violinist. He studied with Isak Perman, but has since become a very, sort of incredible crossover artist and teacher. And so Jeremy one day said to me, he said, Steve, I wrote all these duos for violin and bass. They're, really intriguing kind of, swing tunes and Latin numbers and what have you. And I said, well, show them to me. So he showed me these arrangements that he had made, and I said, well, do you think you could do any of these on bass? And I said, well, let me check them out. So I did, and I encouraged him to rework them for bass, so different keys and what have you. And so we worked them up and were able to play them at one of the bass bashes a few years ago. But at the same time, I also asked him, I said, Jeremy, you studied with Isak Perman. Isak Perman played the solo to Schindler's List for the movie Schindler's List, Steven Spielberg movie. And I said, can you make an arrangement for violin and bass of that beautiful tune? Because it seems like there's this beautiful kind of 2-part interwoven counterpoint for that tune. And he said, sure. And so he came up with this incredible arrangement. So we did that, plus a piece that he wrote called Bahia Norteño, which is a kind of a Brazilian dance number, and then Stromp, which is a really easygoing swing tune, and then Comme il faut, very famous tune by Eduardo Arolas, that means how it's done. Very, very cool, laid-back tune, and then a really clever habanera that he wrote for us. So that's the set of violin and bass duos that I did. And at another bass bash event, I was invited to play something. So I had recently discovered these original pieces by Paul Hindemith for bass and clarinet. This was chamber music that he had written, maybe 1927, and he was, I think, on the faculty at the Berliner Hochschule, the main college of music in Berlin, and he wrote a lot of chamber music at that time for faculty members. And these are very cool character pieces, lots of wit and tongue-in-cheek things. And so I asked my dear friend Carlos Ortega from Colombia originally to do these duos. And I have to mention that some of the titles of these duos, a couple of them are untitled, but one is called Prayer of a Virgin in the Mixolydian mode. So whatever that means. But anyway, or there's one called Canon for Shooting, which is actually a canon, musical canon. Mm-hmm. And he makes fun of that in the music. And then there's one called Broken Melody, which is just a series of broken phrases, and one called March of the Lion's Defense, dedicated to a particular major in the Prussian army. So that's really a fun tune. And there's one called Song, one called Prayer Wheel in the Black Forest. Very evocative kind of piece. And then the last one's called A Little Dance. So these are all really fun character pieces, challenging for the clarinet as well as the bass. I have to say that there's not too many recordings of this piece. And I think this is actually an original recording because I chose to take a few of those movements up an octave, because Hindemith did write later that these pieces could be played by cello. So if they were played by cello, then they would sound up an octave, and I think they sound better. I made a connection with the composer David Garner, who's a faculty member, a colleague at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, and I asked him if he would write me a piece of chamber music, and he said, well, what are you interested in? And I said, well, I'd love to play with wind instruments. And he said, okay, well, what kind of instruments? And so I said, how about oboe, but doubling on English horn, And he said, oh, yeah, sounds very cool. And then how about clarinet, but doubling on bass clarinet? Mm-hmm. I always thought that bass clarinet and bass worked really well together. And so he said, yeah, sounds great. So he wrote this piece called Trio for 5 Instruments. And he's a very interesting composer because he writes using serial technique, but emphasizing developing tonal harmonies and tonal centers, even though you're using a serial technique. So this piece sounds really unique, very different than anything I've ever played before. Yeah. So it's a single movement, but and I also asked him if he'd write it for me, playing it on solo bass, solo tuning bass, and so he did, and subsequently wrote an incredibly difficult cadenza for. But anyway, so it was a really fun project to do because I got to do chamber music. I got to play with other people rather than with piano, and I also got a chance to perform a lot of this prior to making these recordings. I managed to get the recording done January of 2020.
Nice.
And you know that in March of 2020 is when everything shut down. Yeah. So this whole album was then edited and mixed online.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the last piece that you're describing, the trio for 5 instruments. I'm trying to remember if I've seen you play that live. I know I've seen you and Carlos. I'm reliving the concerts as you're describing them, and then you and Jeremy playing those pieces. Did you perform the trio for 5?
Yeah, we've done it twice, and I'm going to do it again. We're going to do it again in February at the San Francisco Symphony Chamber Music Series.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah, it's so much fun playing with wind instruments. I mean, I'm sure you've played Benny's gig many a time.
In fact, recently over the COVID period, with Jerry Seamus.
Yeah,
in fact, made some videos of that.
That's great.
Love those pieces.
Yeah, those are such a fun piece, and I love those titles from Hindemith. I don't think of Hindemith. Whenever I think of Hindemith, I think of like a very serious Germanic sort of person. But yeah. So but I don't know if you've ever looked at Hindemith's music theory book. I haven't looked at it in years, but I remember it.
I read it and worked out of it. Yes.
Okay. The tone of that book, I remember being hilarious. I'm probably getting this wrong, but there was something along the lines of like, he'll describe something and he'll say, if you do not understand, if you are not getting this exercise, get out of music. Go. Leave me. It's like the sort of thing that one might not find in like a 2020, era music theory book.
Right. Well, you poop or get off the pot, as they say.
Yeah.
So basically, so that, I mean, he probably, made people more ardent about doing what, understanding theory and composing and all that. Yeah. He wrote a great book on composition and theory. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, his wife actually learned bass, Hindemith, that is.
Really?
And he wrote some very simple pieces for her. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, really, the Hindemith Sonata, it's if you think of the traditional bass, it's actually, that's part of that whole utility music. I forget what the German is, but he was trying.
Musik.
Yeah, he was trying to fill out the repertoire. But I do think that piece is like a particularly good piece from that. It's sort of like something that I think at least people in my generation, like everybody played it on some recital. I think I played it on my junior recital or something like that. But you go back to it, and actually, there's
a lot of music there.
There's a lot there.
Yeah, and he understood. He was so brilliant. I mean, he could play so many different instruments, and if he didn't know how to play a particular instrument, he learned how to play that instrument, and you can tell from that sonata he knew how to write for the bass. Right? There's everything there is playable.
It was so fun to go and just work with a few other people at a high level. That's got to be a blast for you.
Yeah, because I mean, you get so much from other people. I mean, everybody's an individual and has something to offer.
Yeah.
And so you bring to the table what you understand and feel, and they bring the stuff, and you get really turned on by what they got to offer.
And it's so different from having the conductor up there or you and the pianist or something like that. It's
and also if you're playing with wind instruments, for instance, I mean it's different. The intonation is different, and considering breath and what have you, and balance, lots of balance questions. So on this particular recording, I use two different basses. So for the Hindemith, I'll use my solo bass, which is actually a John Lott bass, tuned up.
Is that the bass that's got the guitar, the bass that I'd be terrified to carry it out on stage because we were to drop it if my hands are sweaty?
Right. It only has this one little handle. But so I use that bass for the Hindemith, and then for the trio for 5 instruments. But then I used an orchestra tune bass for the tunes with Jeremy Cohen with violin. So you can hear different timbre on that.
I rarely play in solo tuning these days, but sometimes I do. Like, what's your experience going over to that? Because most of your life, it'd be fair to say probably you're living in orchestra tuning world.
Right, yeah, and I think I'm fortunate that I don't have perfect pitch. I have very good relative pitch, right? But I don't have perfect pitch. In fact, the problem with having perfect pitch is that, if you look at a note and you play, like, say, an A, it sounds a B, right? And so that can be sort of disconcerting. And in fact, recently I gave a lesson to a student who was playing on solo tuning, and she was just like a mess because, it was really disruptive to her ears, so I don't, so that's the challenge to get over. But for me, when I have no problem transitioning from one bass to the other. I just get myself in the world of the solo bass tone, and the way it speaks, and live with that. And then if I'm in orchestra, I immerse myself in that world of orchestra tuning and how that particular bass speaks. But I'm lucky because my orchestra bass and my solo bass have the same sort of mensur, same string length. So
nice.
I don't have to adjust in that way. And the neck feel is very, very similar. So I recommend that.
Do you keep that John Lott set up in solo tuning?
Absolutely.
As a matter of course? Okay.
Absolutely,
Yeah, that perfect pitch thing is interesting. That brought him up on our last clip. Michael Hovnanian, who I studied with, he had perfect pitch, and he said that he kind of lost it starting to play in solo tuning because he started doing that when he was a teenager and just stopped trusting his ear, putting the finger down and just
so unlearning.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. You go into the world of being a transposed instrument. I mean, I guess we kind of are anyway with the octave because we're playing up an octave. But yeah, it's one of those things that people find super confusing if I bring up solo tuning, especially like people from the wind world. Well, although they transpose too, but it can be confusing.
Well, when I spoke with David Garner about his trio, and prior to writing it, I explained everything about my solo tuning, and I played for him, and he had to wrap his mind around, if I write an F sharp, it's actually going to be a G sharp, that kind of thing, and the whole overtone series and the harmonics are all going to be different, right? So he wrapped his mind around it and figured it out. But I have to say also that I have another bass at home also that I've got in high solo tuning. So that's high C, G, D, A. And have done a number of transcriptions for high solo tuning, as a number of soloists around the world do. And in fact, didn't say this earlier, but in my previous album, Home Bass, I did a couple of tunes using the high solo
Oh,
bass.
you were?
Yeah.
Okay, wow.
I was cheating, right?
I've dreamed about playing around with that tuning. You know, I think I've maybe played like one or two notes on somebody's bass in that tuning. But yeah, talk about opening up a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, the whole bass is tuned to whole fourth higher, right? So whatever you play sounds a fourth higher. Mm-hmm. So you either play you play a fourth lower, but it's not a fourth higher because it's a bass sounds an octave lower than
right.
So it's a fifth lower.
Right.
So without getting too complicated,
and then we throw solo strings on there too. And
no, I don't do that. I just do.
Okay, good.
No, so I'll play the ballade, which is in C minor. I'll play it in G minor, and it allows me to play. There's some really high parts to that. There's one section towards the end. It's called piangendo, which means crying. The music has to cry, and you have to do it very high. And that high solo tuning really helps with that.
It's got to be interesting. I need to spend some more time playing around on that because it's got to really make you change your perspective of the tuning. And even if you just take like a regular bass with an extension, let's say, a demo I used to do for schools all the time is like I'd play my low C, or I even have a B, and then I'd go up and I'd play the top notes on my bass. And then I'd go to the grand piano and I'd go like bonk, that's that note. That's there, and you're like, wow, the bass has almost the range of the piano, and you're talking about like, kind of like educating composers on what the bass can do. That's one thing that kind of freaks people out. I've been talking over the years with somebody who works composes for video games, and every once in a while he'll say like, hey, can I do this on the bass? You've probably had a bunch of conversations like that over the years with composers who are writing for the bass. Like, do you have it? Like, what do composers? There is a question in here, I promise. But what do composers find surprising about the bass, or like, what are some of the things that they're like, oh, I didn't know the bass could do that? Are there any things that you've sort of noticed people like underutilizing or being surprised at?
Well, they're in love with the use of harmonics, mm-hmm. and how clear and available they all are, mm-hmm. and how high they can go and still work. Also, that over the decades, the level of technique on the double bass has just improved immensely. So composers are not afraid to give you, real challenges to work on. So yeah.
That harmonic thing is fascinating, isn't it? That there's a bassist and composer named Sam Suggs. I remember talking to him about that. Yeah, and that was one of the things that he finds the most enjoyable writing for bass. He writes for other instruments too, but for bass, because violin and viola and even cello have harmonics, but they're not in necessarily as optimal a register. Right. Let's say, as bass.
Yeah, the longer the string, the more harmonics there are available, and then also the more resonant mm-hmm. those harmonics are. So they can really project, and they can be very clear. And
did you have more pieces that you were considering than what ended up on here? It might be different because it's a chamber music album for this one, but like, how do you? I guess the question is, how do you pick pieces for an album? How do you narrow that down?
Great question, because, the music has to speak to me. I have to, if it's something that I've commissioned, of course I'm going to dive into it and, really bring it to life. And if it's something that, if I'm looking at something to transcribe, I have to, really be, turned on by, some piece that I've heard. And I think, I have to explore all the possibilities of being able to do it on bass, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, And then if it's a piece that is sort of lesser known or totally undiscovered on the bass, I still have to think it's a quality piece. But for instance, right now, I am working on an incredible piece that I'm hoping to record, and it was something that Lawrence Wolf wrote for me. Larry was looking for a particular kind of bow, and I had a bow that he knew I had, And I sent it to him. I told him that I wasn't using it, and that he could just take it and use it. And he loved it so much that he decided that he wanted to buy it. And I said, no, just keep it. And he said, no. I can't just take something, so I want to pay you back. And I said, okay, Larry, the way you can pay me back is to write me a piece. And so he wrote me this really, really challenging and engaging piece for solo bass. And he calls it Blow Me Done Set. Blow Me Done is a contraction of the phrase blow me down. And Blow Me Down, or Blow Me Done, is the name of a particular windy cliff in Nova Scotia. And he has family ties to Nova Scotia. And he decided to use some of the folk rhythms of Nova Scotia, like in this set of pieces. The prelude is not a dance set, a dance piece, but it's incredible with all this voice leading and arpeggiation and what have you. Second is it's a strathspey. Strathspey is some kind of Celtic dance, and then there's a reel, R-E-E-L, and an air, and a jig, and each one of them is very, very challenging, but really, really well made and well written. And I think that I want to really do it justice. So I've been practicing for maybe 2 years on this one set, and hope to record it in the next few months. And I think that it will actually be a major contribution to the contemporary bass repertoire.
I can't wait to check that out.
Yeah.
On album 4, hopefully that'll anchor the next albums.
So the question is what to do on the other side, Are there sides on albums though?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, but that's part of the fun of it. It's got to be trying to assemble something that works well together. Just like doing a recital, right? Yeah. It's kind of fun to be your own programmer. Cool. Anything else you want to get out about this album? We'll send them to your website and the usual places.
The usual music services have got it, and my website tramontozzimusic.com has links to these recordings. So.
Beautiful.
I wanted to also thank Joe Lewis for doing all the cover design and photography.
It's really cool. Okay, so Joe Lewis did that. Okay, that's great. It's funny. I have known him. We've been connected online for years. It's hilarious. Like, we both were blogging in the mid-2000s and would comment on each other's stuff. And what a small world it is. Now I see him at bass events in the Bay Area.
And he only lives 40 miles from you. So.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah. So, well, Joe used to be a student of mine back in the early 90s. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.